Hello, everybody, and an especially big hello to Ger Graus, who's joined us today. Ger, I'm going to let you introduce yourself. I just wanted to ask you about your OBE. I should have introduced you as Ger Graus OBE. And your OBE is for services to children. So my first question is, how does one come about getting such an amazing accolade as an OBE for services to children?
There's a story, like in most things, there's a story with this. So I was delighted that it was for services to children, first and foremost, as opposed to education or whatever else, because actually we are in, so if you function in the world of education in the broadest possible sense, then we are in the business of serving children. So I was very happy that that was. The second thing is, I was very happy that it was brought about through people who I've worked with and who know me, who must have felt that I was worthy of an honor. So it wasn't a political thing. And thirdly, it's an honorary one because I'm not a British national. I retained my Dutch nationality, and so it's an honorary one. You can't have a proper one if you're not British. And that fourthly means that mostly you're not awarded it by a member of the royal family or in one of the palaces. So I was ecstatic. I was honored, right? Moved. That it was for services to children was amazing. And in the end, what happened was that I was presented with the award by the then Secretary of State for Education, Nicky Morgan, who I knew, and I was delighted that she was prepared to do this. There was an offer that it could be in one of the government residences, whatever it's called. So it might have been 10 Downing Street or whatever. But by that time, we'd opened Kidzania in London. And I asked that I be awarded presented with the award at Kidzania in London, which was quite nice. So Nicky Morgan turned up. And the other thing is I had my family there and lots of friends there. And my goodness, David Ngobeni had flown all the way from Johannesburg. He was the CEO of Kidzania in South Africa. James Neal, my former pupil at Taveram High School, had kind of appeared out of the dust and joined, and lots of friends, and my family and my wife and my children. And I suppose the lasting memory of the day is that it was the people who were there. And it's a very strange thing as a parent. I have 3 children. And it's a very strange thing as a parent to sense that your children are proud of you. Because it is almost always the other way around, because all the formalities even of that sit with the children, the assemblies, the reports, the parents' evenings, where, you know, the achievements in clubs and whatever else. And you go as the parent, you go, oh my God, this is wonderful. And on that day, that sensation, and my 3 children gave a short speech because they wanted to. So it was a great day. If nothing else, it was a great day. And the children bit was special. That it was for that. Yeah, it was great.
Lovely. Thank you for sharing that with us. Your education journey in the UK started in Norwich, is that correct? With Mrs. Daines and 3T?
It started for 1 year only. So I'm about to enter the Guinness Book of Records because 1 year has become 40 odd now, I think. And you know, it's one of those things you stick around and stuff just happens. But I was going to Taveram High School, which at the time was a brand new school in the early 1980s, and still growing. 11 to 16, ended up, by the time I left 5 years later, it had about 500 and something young people. And Mrs. Daines was the head teacher. She had vision, she was kind, she was courageous. She appointed the people, she created the jigsaw. Every member of staff, teaching and non-teaching, was a jigsaw piece, and she put it together, and it served the children. And one of the main things about that school was that we're all like-minded. We're all a bit nuts. We're slightly off the wall. There were some amazingly brilliant people there. There were some teachers there who I just used to sit and go, oh my God, I wish I could do this. Paul Nevins, Richard Taylor, David Roth, Colin Den, David Harding, Mary Nay, Leslie Miller. They're still all here, basically. And one of the things I've done, and I'm doing in my book, just slightly digressing, but it's linked. One of my heroes is Johan Cruyff, both as a football player and as a manager. And he has this thing about, if you put 11 number ones in your team, you haven't got a team. You have 11 number ones. So in each of the positions, right? So I got thinking about who would my 11 teacher team be out of my working life. And Mrs. Daines would be the manager, the head teacher at Taverham High School. But there are many of the teachers there who would be in there, because the school was rich in, if you wish, Kevin De Bruyne's, Eric Cantona's, whatever. But it was also rich in the steady defenders. So it was the mix, and that allowed us to learn from each other. And I loved it. And Mrs. Daines trusted, and no doubt we'll come back to that word, trust. Mrs. Daines trusted us. And on my very first day in September 1983, just before I went to register my tutor group 3T, and I could probably run through those names. She called me to her office and she said, don't forget to enjoy yourself. And when you make mistakes, don't forget to learn from them. Off you go. And I think, and at the time that was really touching, but I was nervous, so I didn't perhaps take as much notice of it as I should have done. But now I think, I wonder how many head teachers in secondary schools on their first day get people into their office and go and make mistakes and learn from them, right? But that's how the school was built. And what then happened was, if you struggled with a certain class or with a certain youngster, you went to others in other subject areas. And I, as a modern languages teacher, very often ended up with the English department and go to wonderful people like Richard Taylor, who was an immense teacher, and say, how do you do this? What am I not doing? And I'm really happy to say that after many, many years, literally after 40 years, a little while ago, I got an email. No, I got a message on LinkedIn from Richard Taylor, and we're kind of, and now we're talking as if those 40 years just weren't there. So it was a wonderful school, but the main thing about the school was, the main thing, and you learn that afterwards, don't you? You remember, the main thing was that every member of staff, including the office staff and the caretaker and Ray, who worked in a library, everybody knew the name of every child. And everybody knew something good about every child. You knew the name of their dog, you knew whatever it was, brother, sister, whether they played the flute or whatever it was. We did. So life was a conversation. And because you know the name of every child, that whole stuff about behavior control, I can't even remember that we did that, to be quite honest. It wasn't always easy, because youngsters are youngsters and teachers are teachers, right? But if I look at it by and large, it was that. So if I'm asked by somebody what's the optimum school size, for me, it's really simple. It is the school where every member of staff knows something good about every child. But that's an educational answer. And of course, we don't make educational decisions. We make economic decisions. We use those words, don't make economies of scale. So, and I also have to say that Taverham High School was a relatively affluent school. So one of the things I've done in my working life is that wherever I've been and whatever I've done, there's something that I've put in my back pocket from there. And I think that's a piece of advice I'd give to anybody. Whatever you do, there's something that you need to hang on to, because at some point later on, you might want to use that.
Yeah, it sounds like Mrs. Daines had like the perfect kind of intro to teaching. Like there is an element of, I think I had a similar experience when I first started teaching, like that, like you're gonna make mistakes, it's okay, learn from them, move on. It's such a powerful message as well.
But you're programmed, aren't you? I'll tell you
Yeah.
a little story. I ran German exchanges. They were hugely successful because I had this thing about purpose. Why study a language if you can't put them in touch, the youngsters in touch with youngsters in other countries? And this was before WhatsApp and all that technology. So I used, and I was interviewed at some point by the Eastern Daily Press, I think the paper was called at the time. And they asked me, why are you taking so many children to Germany? And my reply was, because I want our young people to understand that there's life beyond Lowestoft, which I thought was a really smart reply at the time. And I was being interviewed because Mrs. Daines wasn't in the school or something like that. Anyway, that became the headline or the sub-headline and didn't go down too well with some people.
Mm.
And I was made aware of this. And so when I turned up on the Monday in school, I was fully expecting to be called into the head teacher's office for a word. So nothing happened on a Monday. So that's odd. She must have been busy. So on the Tuesday, nothing happened. And on the Wednesday, nothing happened. So on the Thursday morning, I remember this really clear. I went and knocked on her door. And she said, "Oh, do come in. Do sit down." And I sat down. And she said, "Well, how can I help you?" And I said, "Well, why aren't you telling me off?" And she went, "Because I don't need to." And that was it. And you think back about that, and of course, what also happens, and we must always remember that, is the school where every member of staff knows something good about every child is also the school where the members of staff know each other.
Mm.
Right? And you put that in the mix. And then the irony is I then moved from there. I became head of modern languages at a very large school in Hull, Williford Holby School, which was part of Hull School's reorganization. And I went from a school with 500 children in the school to a school with nearly 500 children in a year group.
Mm.
And the biggest difference was not that the children in Hull it was a very disadvantaged part of the city. The biggest difference was that I didn't know the names of all the teachers.
Yeah.
Let alone the names of all the children. So what happens in those places is that with the very best will in the world, you've got house systems and year groups and everything else. But in the end, you end up focusing on certain sections of the population. And there are sections of that population who, quite frankly, remain grey.
Yeah.
And the irony is, of course, that the youngsters in Hull, because of their context, needed to be known by every member of staff much more than the youngsters in Norwich. So that was another one that went into my back pocket, basically.
I feel like I've had a similar experience actually, because I have been to that school that's around 3,000 children, and then I've also taught at a school where it was just one year group, and so everyone knew everyone, and it was a real like collaborative approach. Like everyone had everyone's back. Like, yeah, that we were in a tough area in Bradford, but it was a beautiful, like supportive system, and that grows, and you lose that, and it is sad, isn't it?
And so we need, I mean, if we decide that we're going to spend the money that we need to spend, then that's it really. Then we need to take that action, and we need to make small schools our focus and our priority.
I thought it was so powerful how you were talking about Mrs. Daines and those type of leaders, because we have this interesting conundrum or paradox in teaching where great teachers are promoted out of the classroom and they do less teaching and then they become leaders, and they don't necessarily have leadership experience or leadership training. But there are a few people I've spoken to. We have another podcast called Too Many Holidays, and we spoke to Tony Ryan, who'd started his own school. We spoke to Bruno Reddy, who'd been a teacher in a new school. We have a lady called Pat Cafferty in our trust at Trinity Academy Leeds, who all put teams together. And exactly like you were saying about Johan Cruyff, they could have chosen 11 outstanding teachers and put them in, but what they chose were people who worked in the team and people who had courage, people who cared, and they all reflected about they wanted to employ people who wouldn't just do the same thing over and over again and expect different results, which is something I've heard you say before about the definition of insanity, that we don't just want to keep doing that. What would
Yeah,
you?
and we have terminology, don't we? We have head teacher or principal, whatever people are called these days, school. But actually, they're very, very different. So what we don't do is we don't contextualize. So there are some examples, and the head teachers is a really good one to begin with. So Jeff Cooling was the head teacher at Winifred Holby School in Hull. And Jeff Cooling, in his own way, was brilliant. He was a manager. He was in a school with an enormous number of children, with an enormous number of teachers, in incredibly challenging circumstances that had just gone through a local authority-wide reorganization. What you need more than anything is not Mrs. Daines. You need a safe pair of hands, right? So that it keeps ticking over. Because the school, to make that comparison, is factory size. So it functions differently than the corner shop. Yeah. And that's what that is. Yet in their training and in the public definition, Mrs. Daines and Jeff Cooling are the same.
Yeah.
And we do that with schools, don't we? So I know schools here in Sheffield and schools I've worked with in Wythenshawe, for example, in South Manchester, where they're really up against it. Brilliant, brilliant schools that are much more than a school. And that incidentally, in attainment terms, for what that's worth, do well. And in Ofsted terms, they are very well compliant, because the Ofsted definition of outstanding is a nonsense, isn't it? It just means that you're really good at ticking boxes. So I can't be doing that. But the issue for me is this, that the schools, my schools in Wythenshawe, the schools here in Sheffield, some of those, they are treated the same as the schools in Kensington and Chelsea, the schools in Leafy Cheshire or wherever else. And to me, that's like comparing Macclesfield Town with Manchester United. And I mean Manchester United in its better days. And and you just can't do that. You wouldn't do that in any other walk of life. And why the judgments on how well schools do don't include much more clearly defined value-added judgments, for example, not just on the results, but on the contribution of teaching, on partnerships, on how the leadership functions. So we're part of a really dull top-down system that actually doesn't make any improvement at all. And one of the things I often say to people, what we do is, when we've got a problem, we change the name. And we think that changing the name solves the problem. So when a while ago, when we had pupils in school, so in my days in Norwich, for example, and in Hull, and when there were issues around, well, the behaviors and what are teenagers like, we started calling them students. And then we went, well, that's that one solved then, really. The fact that we didn't treat them much differently didn't enter people's minds. So years later, another example is that when we had schools that were up against it and that were struggling for all sorts of reasons, internal and external, we went, well, we'll tell you what we'll do, we're going to call them academies. That'll solve the problem. No, doesn't solve the problem at all. You know, you need to be contextual. You need to be contextualized. So actually, you need to turn around and say, if that's appropriate, following the analysis. Well, there's a school there with 2,000 youngsters. Do you know what? If we had 3 schools of 600 plus, that would be much better. And people are going to say, but that's what academy chains are for. No, it's not. Because academies following the election of this disastrous government in 2010, under Labour, academies were last chance saloons, just like education action zones were last chance saloons. They were schools that became well funded, but under direct control of the government, because everything else hadn't really worked. And when the Conservatives came to power, they quite liked that idea of everything being under control of the government and effectively taking democracy out of schooling and education, because local authorities, to all intents and purposes, don't really exist anymore. And they're replaced by quangos. And those quangos are not accountable, because Ofsted is not an accountability thing. It's a joke, right? because the accountability needs to be to the local people.
Mm.
And how can you be
Mm.
accountable to local people if you off-roll youngsters before the exam? If you are selective, if you make policies up on the hoof, if you don't properly consult and communicate with your constituents. Now, there are going to be people saying it's not like that, we're not like that. I get that bit. And good for the people who are not like that. But let's be honest, there are plenty of people who are. Right? And it goes back to, we're not serving children.
Mm.
So what's your advice for those teachers, those leaders, those head teachers in Sheffield and in Manchester? We can't revolt against Ofsted, but we do want to break this cycle, don't we? So what would your advice be to leaders and teachers who can break the cycle in their own classroom or in their own school, even in their own trust, if they're the maths lead for the academy trust? What would your advice be for those people?
I mean, it's probably easier said than done, right? Because I recognize, and don't get me wrong, you know, I've been there, done this. I worked in Hull, and since my time in Hull, I've deliberately stayed in areas that were up against it. I moved to Manchester, I then moved to Salford, I moved back to Wythenshawe, then started working with Children's University, which was all about deprivation. And I suppose that the first message is, occasionally when you find the time, which is a big issue, when you have a time to reflect, I don't know, on the way home or whatever, whilst watching Downton Abbey or the rerun on ITV3, as I am, remind yourself why you got into the job. So you didn't get into the job because of Ofsted, did you, or the DFE? You actually got into the job, presumably, because you wanted to make a difference to the lives of youngsters, and because if you're secondary, on top of that, you like your subject very much. Remind yourself as a head teacher why you do that. And then, yeah, then you have on the one hand, you have all the boxes that you, on the one sheet, all the boxes that you need to tick. And on the other sheet, you then have how you're going to tick this.
Is this where trust comes back in as well?
And it comes
about trust.
It comes back to that. But so, for example, I would never understand, and I've been puzzled by this. So I go into secondary schools and they're teaching Shakespeare to the youngsters, and they never take them to see a play.
Yeah.
Why would you do that? And incidentally, Shakespeare's kind of turning in his grave, right, at an enormous speed these days, no doubt. So if you teach languages, put them in touch with kids. Yeah. In other countries, and then they go, we can't use the technology, we can't use. There are always excuses, aren't there? I wish I wanted to teach. If I wish, let me put it like this, that in my day, the technology had existed that exists now. I want to stand in front of a class as they walk in and go, have you got your phones on you today? Are they charged up? Right, we're going to turn them on. We're going to set up WhatsApp groups. They're doing the same in Germany in our partner school at the moment. And let's see where we can get with this. They're focusing on places to live, and we're focusing on food. So can we make that work in a dialogue? Why would you not do that? And then the answer always is, but you know, God knows when they go online, we don't know what they're going to look at. You can, well, your firewall can't be very good then either in the school, right? So instead of coming up with excuses not to do things,
do you think
be courageous teachers? Because it's fun.
I think that is true, and like being courageous teachers it is fun to be courageous, but it is difficult to do sometimes in the situation that teachers find themselves in right now. And I think especially that teachers themselves, I had such a tough job during COVID, especially that second lockdown in the UK particularly. I remember my husband's a teacher, and I remember him going and teaching and going into school, but also doing online, and it's got massive, hasn't it? And And I think potentially there's an element of actually we need to, get them, teachers need to remember why they joined the profession. They need to remember that actually they love their subject and they love teaching children and they love teaching their passion. And when you get back to that, that's when you see some magic happen in the classroom. And it's just so lovely to see, isn't it? And we have that opportunity in this day and age where we are able to do things that we were never able to do when we were taught at school. And that's scary though as well, because people like familiarity, don't they? They like that idea that actually they're in an environment where they knew what came before.
I just think it's just really exciting. And you know what? The other thing I sometimes get is, but that's all very well what you're saying, but I'm not allowed to do that in my school. Leave. There's a teacher shortage. Leave. Whatever you do, that would be one piece of advice. If you're not happy where you're working, it can't be sunshine every day.
Absolutely.
But as a rule, if you can't be happy for 3 to 3.5 days a week in what you're doing, you need to leave.
For me, that comes back to trust again. And just to give a primary maths example of that, I feel like we have the opportunity to teach maths in a really lovely way, a really exciting way. And sometimes if we're following this old pattern of a maths lesson looks like the children sit down, they get their books out and they do some calculations in the book, and you're not happy with that as a teacher, then like you say, a change needs to be made. And from a maths lead point of view, potentially, we need to trust our teachers. And we're not looking for a piece of work in the book 5 days a week. Potentially, if your maths lead is looking for that, then have they got that trust? Are they allowing you to teach with manipulatives? Are they allowing you to go outside and do some real world examples? Are they allowing you to walk down to the local shop and have those experiences which learning maths will lead into? And potentially we do this quite well in early years, that we don't often have books in early years. There's not that expectation of sitting down at tables, and the amount of maths opportunities in early years is absolutely huge. But suddenly we get into year 1 or into year 2, and the expectation is, right, sit down, open your books, let's do some calculations. And if the maths lead trusted the teachers a little bit more, they wouldn't be looking through the book scrutiny thinking, oh, you've only got 2 pieces of evidence this week. That means you've only done 2 maths lessons. Of course it doesn't mean that. Of course maths has happened every day, but trust your teachers and allow them to explore purposeful maths in the right way. I know you work with early years children quite a lot. And I also know, I just want to link this in, that you ask children wherever you go, why you go to school. Yeah. And what would you like their response to be?
I'd like them to have an answer. Because the answer I get in about 80% of the cases is because I have to. That's not an answer. That's a sad case. Right?
Yeah.
But it's about purpose, isn't it? But I think what we need to remember, if we go back over my 40 or so years from Mrs. Daines to now, is the introduction of the national curriculum. There was a need for it at the time, right? But we might have done it differently. We might have done it with more trust. So somebody decided in sanctuary buildings in London or wherever else that these were the subjects that everybody had to be taught, not learned. Right? Then with each of those subjects came the content. They became the programs of study and the schemes of work and whatever else they became. Right? And from that, the lesson plans. Then Ofsted came along and started to check the system. What happens then over time is that you begin to train your teachers to deliver the system. Mm-hmm. Yeah. So the whole thing, that kind of creativity, independent thinking, that courageous bit is actively taken out of it. Mm. At the same time, if you're sitting at the bottom of all that, if you're the child, like Ken Robinson used to say, we then teach creativity out of them, right? And I think we need to make a very clear distinction between a couple of things, in our heads at least. There's a difference between schooling and education. If you're well schooled, you have a better chance of educating yourself better for the rest of your life. That's the relationship. Yeah? There is a difference between learning and being taught. What we have in this country in our teach and test system is we have little learning. We have a great deal of being taught. Mm. Now, the brilliant teacher in the smallest possible way. And I often use that example, right? So every time you engage with the young people about an abstract, use the words "for example." Because "for example" is a story. For example makes that learning visible. When I was a kid, my maths teacher, meneer Jongstra, if A is 2 and B is 3, what is C? I have no idea what you're talking about. I don't understand your language.
Yeah.
This is a complete and utter waste of time. If he turned around and quoted in the sense David Winner, and it said, Johan Cruyff is called Pythagoras in boots because he makes the team play in triangles. I'd have been off, right? That would have been me done, completely hooked. Okay? So the 4 examples are the hooks, they're the tin openers. And we need to think about learning rather than being taught. We need to think about understanding and doing something with that understanding as opposed to passing the test. An interesting one is this whole climate change thing that Nadim Zahawi, one of the 10 Secretary of State for Education we've had in the last fortnight or whatever it's been, he wanted climate change on the curriculum. But you've got to get your head around this, right? As a natural science. So I teach you what's wrong, and then I test you what you've remembered, and then we've solved the climate change issue. we need to wonder about what our outcomes sometimes are. And in this example, I would argue that the outcome is activism.
Yeah. Thinking
And
about
not-
thinking about your hook and those bits and pieces as well. We actually do have a session in the conference in the 24-hour for Good conference, which is about starting with the problem or starting with the practice in secondary maths. So it might be a great one to engage with, actually, because I think it's essentially talking exactly about that. Do you start with that abstract concept, or do you start with that hook, that problem, and things like that? So I think there's a nice little debate going on in that.
And I think the better do you know your children, the better decisions you will make in that area. I had a history teacher, Meneer Marsh, and this is in the 1970s, right? So there was an oil crisis. There was trouble in the Middle East once more. And what he would do is this was part of my A-level, he would turn up with a newspaper and there was a headline that basically said, oil crisis, car-free Sundays, whatever we had. And he would turn around and go, right, today we're going to be Poirot. We're going to find out where that comes from. Off to the library, because there was no internet, whatever else. And so essentially, you had the purpose of finding out, presented to you right at the beginning. And then you went back, and incidentally, I discovered that, and this is while I was still living in Holland, that most things that went wrong in history were the fault of the British. So that was an interesting, or the Empire, should I say? But it was an interesting way of working. And what I also know is that he had different approaches with different classes.
Yeah, that's interesting. It allowed you to learn the skills that you needed to go into the world as well, didn't it? I am really conscious of time. So I think it is a perfect opportunity to kind of pause there and say thank you so much for your time, Ger. It's been absolutely lovely to listen to you and to just have a wave of your experience wash over us as well. I think that's fun.
My final reflections are that you'll have heard this before, Ger, but Alex Beard describing you as a mix of Jean-Jacques Rousseau and Willy Wonka, and potentially as teachers we all need to be a bit more Jean-Jacques Rousseau and a bit more Willy Wonka, and just have the confidence to do that.
Of course, and I just to end on that again, really, I mentioned it such a lot, but for all the teachers out there, it is true that in 50 years' time, somebody somewhere will mention your name. And it's up to you what they'll be saying.
Perfect end, I think.
Thank you so much.